So I'm here with Joe Shields, who I made the acquaintance of as he became a volunteer here at Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum. A true history enthusiast, somebody who knew the neighborhood very well. He had family who is associated with the neighborhood for multiple generations. He came in very enthusiastically and was an incredible volunteer who took up some projects on his own and just kind of ran with them, especially with our mausoleum inventory. And Joe has now worked himself into a full-time role at Bellefontaine Cemetery. So that is just awesome that we have a volunteer who moved over into the staff, because who better to know the cemetery than somebody who's got a passion about it before they even get here.
And that is a perfect segue for me to introduce Dan Fuller, the Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum Cemetery Chronicler. Passion best describes Dan's philosophy and outlook for the cemetery. I met Dan as a volunteer one summer afternoon, every bit of, Dan, was that 2018?
Mm-hmm.
So I've always had an interest in the cemetery. Like Dan had said, my family has been associated with the cemetery for 151 years. And so it's a hot summer day. I'm at the cemetery next door doing genealogy, and I'm taking pictures. I'm on the ground. My back is full of grass. It's 200 degrees outside. So I come over here and I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to take a shot and go in the office and ask if I could help with clerical work or just be a part of it. And Dan was behind the main counter, and there was another longtime volunteer behind him. And I introduced myself and I said, hey, do you have a volunteer program? And Dan, with the biggest smile on his face, didn't even break a sweat, just kept looking at me, but grabbed it for an application under the desk and gave it to me. And look where we're at now. Dan created the volunteer program at Bellefontaine, where they started out with, I believe, less than 7 volunteers. Now we have well over 100. That is I would dare say, one of the most, if not the most vibrant volunteer communities in the St. Louis area. What the volunteers do for us at the cemetery is invaluable. And that's all because of a grassroots effort by Dan to build an organization that empowers people. And if anybody ever gets a chance to meet one of our volunteers, this is what you're going to hear time and time again. So as our cemetery chronicler and historian or archivist, Dan is going to help tell the stories of the cemetery. Dan is going to help unearth our history after 175 years. And I like to use the term expose the soul of the cemetery. So that is Dan's role. And he does it very well. So Dan, my path to the cemetery started when I was a little boy, being here as a child with my family. Tell me how you arrived at the cemetery.
I bought a house. And it sounds funny, but in St. Louis, that's kind of a normal thing. You buy a historic house and you're curious about who lived in it. And so Tom Allen, my partner, did quite a bit of research. And one of the things he identified is one of the last of the families had association with Bellefontaine Cemetery. So we came up very arbitrarily. And it just so happened that the very next week they were going to have this event called Bellefontaine in Bloom. And so we decided, hey, well, let's go check it out. And we came up, and it was one of the very first times the cemetery was kind of open to the general public. We really enjoyed it. And Sherry Kohler, who is still with us today in the office, said, hey, look, we're really needing some people who have some passion about history and aren't afraid to get their feet wet in the grass of the cemetery. And as I always say, I auditioned for my role as a volunteer and became a volunteer for Bellefontaine Cemetery. And then within a year, the cemetery asked me to be a consultant. And so, as Joe said, we had 7 volunteers. After the year and a half of being a consultant, we had about 24, which rivaled the population of the staff. And they created a full-time role for me in the volunteer coordinator. And as, again, Joe has said, we're now over 100 volunteers. And it is definitely quality volunteers. It's just not a number. Those 100 are pretty passionate about the cemetery. They come with a certain passion, and we definitely feed that curiosity and interest, and they go crazy with it. Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum is the first garden cemetery west of the Mississippi, and this concept began at Père Lachaise in Paris, France in 1804, and is really a departure from the then graveyard system to the now cemetery system. And part of that demographic that we fit so well into is an hour away from a city center. But you have to put yourself into historic context. And so an hour is 4 to 5 miles, because that's what a horse and buggy would travel in 1849. And the cemetery is predominantly family lots. Family comes in and buys something for 4, 8, 12. John O'Fallon bought something big enough for 500. And so the feel and texture of the cemetery is very different than most cemeteries that do not fit that garden variety.
And we're going to get into that right after a word from our sponsors.
Podcasts are a powerful tool to reach your target market in today's digital age. Here's why. Listeners can tune in whenever and wherever they want, fitting your podcast seamlessly into their lives. Unlike videos, podcasts don't require full attention, allowing listeners to multitask while absorbing your message. Podcasts foster a more intimate and personal connection with your audience compared to text-based content. Podcasts allow you to niche down and target a specific audience with interests directly relevant to your message. Now, why launch your podcast with EG Media Group? EG Media Group is a one-stop shop for all your podcasting needs. We are here to help you with strategic planning. We'll develop a plan to reach your target audience and achieve your podcasting goals. Our team will ensure your podcast sounds professional and polished. We'll help you get your podcast out there and reach new listeners. So, if you're looking to leverage the power of podcasting to connect with your target market, visit egmediagroup.com today and turn your podcasting dream into a reality. That's egmediagroup.com. EG Media Group. Create, connect, convert.
So Bellefontaine Cemetery in Arboretum is a rural or garden cemetery, as Dan alluded to just a few minutes ago. This is one of, right now, a handful of historic rural cemeteries left in the U.S. The first of these cemeteries was Mount Auburn in Boston that opened up in 1831. Between 1831 and 1870, roughly 30 of these cemeteries would come online. Anywhere from the East Coast, you would go to the Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, and then it doesn't really stretch further than Minneapolis in that time frame, in the mid to late 19th century. So we're right in the middle of that entire movement. We were incorporated by an act of Missouri General Assembly in May of 1849. And the people who founded the cemetery, or the people who signed the charter, were some of the civic rock stars of 19th century St. Louis. That includes Philander Salisbury and James Yateman.
Yep. There's quite a few individuals that people in St. Louis know. There's even the one that got away from us. That's John Darby, who was one of our early St. Louis mayors and later on decided to kind of pick up stakes here at Bellefontaine Cemetery and move next door to Calvary. But as they say, that's another story.
For another time. I know I'm a little bit biased because I'm here in St. Louis, but I visited many of these other cemeteries in the U.S., and they're beautiful in their own right. But I consider us probably one of the 2 or 3 jewels of the rural cemetery system because we are a perfect balance of horticulture and architecture. We're not too crowded with structures, and we're not just a cemetery that doesn't have large monumentation. We have rolling hills, brooks, 15 miles of winding road. But then we're also one of 44 level 3 arboretums in the world. And I think the balance that we have really sets us apart from all of these rural garden cemeteries in the U.S.
To me, the most important part is we're a middle-aged cemetery. We're not done. We're not even close to being done. Many of our East Coast counterparts are kind of winding down. There might be in their 75 to 80% range, but we've got half of our ground still available for new concepts and ideas in the death and dying industry. And that is at the essence of who we are. We are a place of final rest. So we get to do a lot of fun things here. We explore history. We expose history. As Joe was saying, we expose the soul of the cemetery. But we are a vital component of living humanity today, and we're able to take care of those families. And that's at the essence of what we're doing. Our president, Sherry Smith, likes to talk about this from a standpoint of after the family leaves, we're the ones who are, carrying on many of these stories and keeping those stories alive. And so she calls that aftercare.
One of the brilliant aspects of the cemetery that I love to highlight on my tours is the way history intersects here. You're going to have history in every city, in every major metropolitan area. But what I can tell you, and which we'll get into in the future, is how incredibly history intersects on a regional and national and global scale here. I tell people on my tours that the cemetery is a collision of coincidence, unlike nothing I've ever seen in any of our other cemeteries. And a phrase that I want to use today, that I hope that we continue to get into as things roll on, is, this is so St. Louis. It's a spirit of St. Louis. It's the gateway to the West. During the Civil War, we weren't North, we weren't South. We were split down the middle. The vibe of St. Louis, the people that make up St. Louis, just everything about St. Louis is so unique. And you can tell that by the stories that we have in the cemetery and the people that chose us as their final place of interment. It's unreal.
So this is where, again, Joe and I are kind of two sides of the same coin. He might say split right down the middle. I see it more as a jagged zipper. So it wasn't as clean and defined. In fact, that's one of the things we always talk about. Whenever I do a Civil War tour, I will always ask, did Missouri secede from the Union? And I just love the pregnant pause that comes from the crowd, because it isn't an easy answer. And no, it's not very defined. It's a lot of shades of gray. And the cemetery is a platform being able to have some of these difficult conversations that maybe people are a little bit uncomfortable in having, maybe something that they have chosen to kind of step aside. And, this is an even playing field. And so we get an opportunity to have some of those difficult conversations here. And I think people are really honest because they know the 87,000 people who are laid to rest here are listening in.
Definitely.
So one of the big misconceptions about St. Louis, and I'll start with Calvary, is that they are the Catholic and we're the Protestant cemetery. Technically, Calvary is a non-denominational cemetery, meaning open to all Christian beliefs. And that's with the Catholic card. So one of the two in a relationship had to be Catholic. And if both were Catholic, they could be in the Catholic section. If they were Catholic and a Baptist, Catholic and a Methodist, then it could be in the non-Catholic section. We, in comparison, are non-sectarian. And most people, I find, do not understand what that means because they think, again, it is a necessity of belief in a religion, and a non-sectarian means believers and non-believers alike. So on our 314 acres now, there can be found Orthodox Jewish, Muslim, Feng Shui, every flavor of Christianity. I get this question all the time. Yes, we let the Catholics in. I don't know why we get that question. But we have believers and non-believers alike on our 314 acres, and it allows a lot of mixed concepts and ideas. And the one that I'm sure the listeners were probably going to is that means that we are void of religion, and that is exactly the opposite. One of our wonderful volunteers focuses just on the individuals of the cloth, and he's identified over 50 different religious beliefs on our 314 acres. So it's that mix. It's bringing everybody, not letting anybody out. So we happen to be recording in Hotchkiss Chapel, which is a non-sectarian place to remember the people who have passed. The first part of the structure is a chapel, and we're recording in what was known as the receiving tomb. The receiving tomb was a necessary component of a turn-of-the-last century cemetery where your loved one would lay until the spring thaw and we could break ground. In 2009, this complex was remodeled, and where we're at now is a columbarium, and that is a place to put cremated remains, and so there's over 600 niches.
Dan had just mentioned that we're in a columbarium. It's space designated for the retention of cremains. And I want to talk about dispositions, your choices of burial, especially the mid-19th century and how that's evolved to where we're at now. So this cemetery, and most cemeteries, is going to have a public columbarium, and then you also have a choice to build a private columbarium. There are monuments out in these, not only this cemetery, but other cemeteries that might look like just an ornate obelisk or just a stately piece of monumentation, but look closely when you're in these cemeteries because you might see a door that would open up, and then you would have an opportunity to place cremains inside the monument, or even here, there's a very large monument with a slot, and you just deposit the cremains almost like you would the mail, and then they just would fall to the bottom of the vessel, and that's where the loved one would reside. Mausoleums, that's my passion. That's one thing that I took charge of, I should say. When I became a seasoned volunteer, I started a project to inventory all of our structures. And those are amazing in themselves. It's art, it's architecture. There's artifacts in these just stately structures. So that's another method of disposition. You could be in the ground, you could be in the walls, you could be in a sarcophagus. There are underground crypts. Most of these rural cemeteries from the 19th century do have a healthy amount of underground crypts that as you pass them, you would never know. That you would have to, in the 19th century, go to the main office and grab instructions to access these wonderful gems. You'd have to measure so far from a tree or so far out in front of a monument, and you have to bring a certain gauge of chain with you. And you would have to bring so many ox with you to hook these chains to a set of iron rings and then pull back a stone that exposes a set of stairs that goes down to an underground burial chamber. It could be a brick-lined burial vault with crypts in a wall, or it could be an entire room where you would have shelves, 2 levels of shelves for people to put caskets in a vault and then on a shelf.
But to kind of build on the choice thing, and he likes the elaborate, we offer a lot more opportunities for people that are not opportunities in many other cemeteries. So we have so few rules and regulations that green burials are able to be done here because we do not have outer container rules and regulations. One of the newest trends is aquamation or alkaline hydrolysis. That is not acceptable in the Catholic belief. And so that would be something that would not be possible for somebody who was going to be at Calvary, who happens to be next door. So there's a lot of options for people. My favorite, and again, I always have to throw this in, we had a foreman who I thought was very creative. I used to get along with him very, very well. And John died far too young, very unexpectedly. And his dream was to be cremated and shot out of a cannon.
Monumentation is very personal. I've seen lots in Bellefontaine and other cemeteries that have zero monumentation. You're talking upwards of 20 people, 20 family members on a large lot. You would never know it. You walk right past it and it looks empty. It looks for sale, like it could be for sale. I've seen a laser etching of Darth Vader on the headstone here because the person who died was a huge fan of Star Wars. And we've even buried somebody in my time here, an avid fisherman, was cremated and his cremains were put in his tackle box and they buried the tackle box. So there's burial dispositions. It's just amazing that I think that the general public does not realize the variety of what can be done. It's
personal preference, and some places do not allow, we'll say that, artistic expression, where those kind of things with an establishment that has few rules and regulations can. And I think that's the conundrum for a lot of people, in the fact that they think old, set in their ways, when actually we are not hampered by the things that came in those middle years. So 1910s, 20s, World War I, World War II come about, everybody's going to go into an outer container. We do not have that aspect here. In fact, I can honestly say that just across from us at 12 o'clock, there will be a coffin-only burial, so that's not going to go into an outer container, and that's something that we can do here. So interestingly enough, here at Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum, the garden aspect has always been a part of us. That's been who we were since 1849. With 80% of the family lots occupying the grounds, the component of that I didn't tell you before is that those family lots are circles, squares, rectangles. I even have a heart-shaped family lot. And so when you put a circle and a square next to one another, you get these voids. And those voids are going to be very elemental to planting of trees, because we cannot plant a tree where anybody is or will be in the future. And so the trees were always a component and always something that we could go ahead and put in place. You'll hear a little bit more about what it means to be an arboretum here in a moment, but we didn't have to study for that test. We were already there. We just had to fill out the paperwork.
You know, the rural or garden cemetery in the 19th century had such an impact on culture. People's perspective on death and dying changed. It became a little bit more mainstream. It slowly became more acceptable because these cemeteries were meant to provide a quote-unquote home for people instead of just a drab, spooky, depressing graveyard behind a church that might fall into disrepair. And like Dan had said, by our very nature, we had thousands of trees here because we started out with our first 138 acres, and over the last 175 years, there's been numerous land purchases that take us to 314 acres. So about, I would say, 10 or 11 years ago, the cemetery became serious about creating us as an arboretum in the arboretum community. And through very dedicated staff, very dedicated effort from the Board of Trustees to our president, they invested a lot of resources into building an arboretum program to where now ArbNet, or the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, is the only globally recognized entity to give arboretum accreditation status globally. And we, as of September of 2022, have become a level 3 arboretum. So that means we have greater than 9,000 trees. We have more than 500 woody species of plants. And we partner with academic institutions for research, whether we allow other people to use our space for scientific research. And the horticulture staff that we have is just incredible, with a capital INC. I mean, guys, these folks are just the best of the best.
Yep, they stay necessarily very busy. on our 314 acres. And here's the thing, and people think, oh, you put up a tree and that's it. We cull and remove 100 trees a year, whether the nature does them or we take them down, making room for the 250 trees we might plant that year, always trying to increase our diversity. That is what's important. I'm going to tell you about one particular tree, large leaf magnolia, which originally had a grow range that terminated at the panhandle of Florida. But we are successfully growing them here, and that is a lot to do with the climate change that we're experiencing. And so as an arboretum, we're kind of setting a benchmark to say, hey, these are trees that you can now plant and grow successfully that maybe you couldn't have done 2 decades ago. This is a place for experimentation. This is a place that we kind of push the limits a little bit. And it's important that we are part of the Arboretal Society because we share with those other institutions. We have a very extensive oak collection, and so it's not unusual for us to gather acorns, make little baby oaks, and then we'll share those with another arboretum who might be able to share something back with us. And it's about that global diversity that, is kind of an optimistic viewpoint in a time change where, there's a lot of hard decisions coming down the line. So we are an arboretum, but as a garden, or as Joe was pointing out too, a rural cemetery, this is also about the other plant material that's here. So we do have more formalized gardens. Wildwood Valley is the first ever botanical garden setting in a cemetery that we know of in the United States with 17,000 individual plants. And we've had some people, as Joe referred to, who have been very passionate about the horticultural aspect, and that includes a gentleman who is known worldwide as the bulb master. And so we have lilies and daffodils and other bulb-based plants that are here because he took the time to spend some time with us. We have over 250,000 daffodils. Many of those are along our 3.7-mile tour line trek so that people can really experience them right now here at the cemetery. And then, again, the reputation gets out there, and somebody like Judy Waters finds out that maybe this is a place that she can gift her better than 200 different varieties of irises. She struggled with cancer the last 4 years of her life. She couldn't tend that garden. And so she would pass those on to us. And then at the end of her life, her favorite 25% came to us. And that is a continuation of yet another way of memorializing somebody with the plant material. So the horticulture and history, I always used to think of as separately, but they really do intertwine here at Bellefontaine.
And visually, there's no other word to describe the cemetery, especially today, other than stunning. As soon as you drive into our main entrance off of West Florissant Avenue, you are immediately greeted with rich and vibrant purples and pinks of the trees. And then 200,000 daffodils are really starting to show off right now. Then you have the purple of the crocuses. Because of the horticulture team strategically placing these assets as you drive, it's just, you see the same plant life and you see the same scenes repeating, but the way they're arranged makes it almost just a new experience as you take a twist and a turn and you wind through our 15 miles of roads.
Yeah. They're not parallel roads.
No.
And again, that's intentional. They're following the contours of the land. This is where we introduce somebody's name, Almarin Hotchkiss, who is identified as we'll call him our creator. He came to us from Greenwood Cemetery in New York, where they had just done an extension of a garden cemetery there. And so it's our founders who basically swiped him away, brought him here to the Midwest to create the first one west of the Mississippi. And it's all intentional, but it feels so natural. Most of the ground is left the way it was, but it has to be manipulated so that you can have egress through the 314 acres. And at that particular point, of course, it is designed for horse and buggies. In 1852, just a couple of years after we were founded, a man named Eggleston did our very first, very picturesque map. And within it, it says The Tour. So people come in all the time thinking, oh, you just started touring in the last decade and a half. No. We've been touring a place to experience this natural landscape our entire existence. So the horticulture and the history are definitely blended one-to-one. So as a guide, a master guide here at Bellefontaine Cemetery, one of the questions we always get is, what is the oldest burial here? And I always have to tell people there's 3 answers to that question.
And we'll talk about those 3 subjects right after this.
Discover Bellefontaine Cemetery, a hidden gem in St. Louis with 175 years of history. Join us for sunset walks and explore the rich history of our legendary beer barons. As the only Level 3 arboretum in the region, our grounds are home to majestic trees and breathtaking landscapes. Whether you're a history buff, nature enthusiast, or just seeking a peaceful escape, Bellefontaine has something for everyone. Experience where history and nature intertwine. Visit Bellefontaine Cemetery this summer. Your adventure awaits.
So Dan, now that we're back, you had just mentioned we're going to talk about 3 items. Tell me what those items are.
So, and again, this is probably my personality. I'm a little bit precise about things, but we began in 1849, and in 1850 we did our very first burial, a man named Edward Rutledge, and that was April of 1850. However, we are built on the Hempstead farm, and so the Hempsteads had their own family graveyard, and we know through our due diligence that we have burials that took place on these grounds going back to 1812. But we had 54 cemeteries in downtown St. Louis originally, and after 1849, it was mandated that they be all shut down and moved, and many of those people would find their way here. And so you could potentially find a monument here with late 1700s dating. You just have to know that they did not come to us originally. And this is one of those other components that people have wrong about cemeteries. They think we are focused on death. We're not focused on death. We're focused on arrival.
So I'm going to touch on the phrase "so St. Louis" that I hope to, as time goes on, we're going to keep hammering on that because St. Louis does have a uniqueness about it, unlike most metropolitan cities in the U.S. So the history of the cemetery. So, and I'm going to put this in the context of "so St. Louis." It's amazing the stories that run through St. Louis that don't necessarily originate in St. Louis. Let's talk about the residents who we have, who chose us to be their final place of rest. You're going to have one of the greatest engineers of all time, born in the 19th century, that had zero schooling. And I mean zero, Z-E-R-O, formal education. But he is now considered one of the greatest engineers of all time, right up there with Leonardo da Vinci. You're going to have incredible women's history. The woman who won the first Pulitzer Prize for poetry, Sarah Teasdale. You're going to have enslaved people from the 19th century that just define the word heroic with the struggles that they had to endure. Architects, you're going to have one of 3 Louis Sullivan masterpieces on Prospect Street with the Wainwright Mausoleum, and the other 2 of Louis Sullivan's masterpieces are in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. You're going to have a lot of firsts here. The very first St. Louis police chief, the first 2 fire chiefs for the St. Louis Fire Department. 47% of all St. Louis mayors are here. Bellefontaine Cemetery has the highest census of politicians that Missouri has sent to Washington, D.C. since 1821. No other cemetery in the United States can come close to those numbers, even by half. Any subject of history that you could approach Dan and I about, I guarantee you that we will have just a significant census of men and women in the cemetery who pioneered these industries regionally and globally. And beer, I can't believe I've waited this long to talk about beer brewing, being from St. Louis. Adolphus Busch, Eberhard Anheuser, Max Feuerbacher, Ferdinand Harold, William Jacob Lemp. We can just go on and on and on with our beer barons.
And then there he is. He didn't talk about the person who gets the most visits here, and that's William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. And he's the reason why I said before, it's not about death, it's about arrival. William Clark died in 1838. If you're paying attention, you'll know that we were not a cemetery then. He was buried in downtown St. Louis at his nephew's graveyard. That's John O'Fallon. And he was brought here in 1860. So if you were to look in our system, you would see his burial date is 1860. And that is a clue to all of those genealogists and family historians out there that it's about arrival. When did that individual who's there now get to there? And that there is, of course, Bellefontaine Cemetery. And as Joe was alluding to, we have a lot of firsts. He, can't help it. He missed a couple. The first American woman to receive a Nobel Prize in the form of Gertie Corey. But guess what? She's not here. She's a cenotaph. And that's yet another one of those things that we try to educate people on. Cenotaphs, by definition, are empty tomb. That is memorialization without human remains. And people would kind of say, well, why bother? Well, Gertie Corey was the first American woman to receive a Nobel Prize. She needs a place to be remembered. She needs a place that people can come and acknowledge her role here in our very rich history. And again, the stories go on. And as Joe was alluding to, I mean, there's really not a topic because we are open to one and all. So there's no ifs, ands, buts, or maybes as far as can you be here. They're all here.
I'm glad you mentioned that because the focus of the podcast is going to be St. Louis history. And then we're going to explain how that history runs through Bellefontaine Cemetery. But we're also going to talk about national history, how it runs through other rural cemeteries, how these other rural cemeteries work, the way that these other rural cemeteries like us are redefining ourselves nationally. You know, now that we're almost 200 years old, these other rural cemeteries are finding ways to monetize their grounds, to become relevant in their own metropolitan area as a cultural institution, philanthropic efforts with their respective communities. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
And we want to keep in mind those folks that are close to us, too. We have connections to Hillcrest Abbey, the first crematory west of the Mississippi. We can't have conversations in the cemetery without talking about our next door neighbors, Calvary, Valhalla Cemetery, Lake Charles Cemetery, St. Peter's and Paul. I mean, all of those. Greenwood Cemetery of St. Louis, predominantly African-American cemetery here, which is steep in history and, more importantly, in the throes of reclaiming their history, discovering and rediscovering and deeper diving, just like we're doing, and embracing it, a history quite often that has been overlooked by contemporary society. So, you know, again, we can't have these conversations without zeroing in on some ways to make things just a little bit lighthearted. So, you know, I'm notorious for saying, oh, we're in the dead center of the cemetery, or let's dig a little bit deeper. I always have to clarify with our horticulture volunteers when they come in that we're only going to have them dig in certain places. It's just one of those things. But at the end of the day, I think we're all digging it.
I am your co-host, Joe, and I have the privilege of hosting this podcast with Dan. And we thank you for tuning in. And we highly encourage you to listen to the next episode because you never know what we're going to dig up. And I hope you dig it.